First of all, thank you so much for coming out tonight. I do realise I'm in competition with Barbara Dixon, who is playing live at the Victoria Hall tonight, and I'm honoured that you've chosen to come here instead of seeing Barbara Dixon. So thank you ever so much. And also thank you ever so much to Ted Maguire, who I did notice in the Craven Herald yesterday, wrote this. Brilliant local historian Sarah Lister is set to deliver a fascinating insight into the backstories of the quietest corner of the village. Well, that's something to live up to, isn't it? So I hope I managed to do that. I was also particularly inspired by the following entry, which says, "The return of Rathmell's hugely popular fish and chip subway is closing in." So I thought, yes, I like the sound of that. But anyway, I hope this doesn't disappoint. Some of you, I recognise your faces. I came and did a talk. It was one of the earliest ones we did, wasn't it, Rosemary?
Yeah.
Last September.
To the Thursday Club.
The Thursday Club, that's right. And I must say, you were an absolute, those of you that were here from then were an absolutely wonderful audience. And we really enjoyed it, all of us. So I hope it's as good tonight. And apologies if it's not. So, let's just get going. First of all, Ken, a few minutes ago, went round with small bits of paper, each with the name of the person on. Has everybody got a piece of paper?
Yes. I've just done the book, sorry.
That's fine, you can put yours there, Brian, that's absolutely fine. Has everyone else got one? Yes. Now, we do have a few spare ones. Would anyone like another one?
I haven't got one.
Rosemary hasn't got one. If you would like to have two pieces of paper instead
No,
of one,
I can
you're
manage
very
with one.
welcome.
One's difficult enough. Thank you.
Margaret will have another one. Right then, okay. So, this graveyard project then, what is it all about? Well, the bottom line is that every grave, when you look round the churchyard in Rathmell, every gravestone is basically sitting upon a life story waiting to be told. Some of them are very recent, but plenty are quite old. And all of them have got a life story attached to them, obviously. And whether or not they've got a gravestone, underneath there are bodies who had their whole lives. And our project, which we began in Settle, has basically evolved to research the lives of those people and find out what contribution they made to the local life. Obviously, we started in Settle. The church in Settle, Holy Ascension Church, that I'm sure some of you are familiar with, had its 180 years anniversary 2 years ago, and as part of that, a group of us from the family history group decided it'd be a good idea to record the inscriptions of the gravestones. You've already done that in Rathmell, so you're ahead of us. Anyway, that's what we decided to do. And at the end of the first evening, it was a beautiful evening, like it was today, only a lot warmer because it was June. We stood around this particular grave of Isabella Stubbs, and we all thought, well, I wonder who she was. She was 22, I wonder who she was. And it turned out she was virtually a member of the aristocracy. Her brother was the Bishop of Oxford. Quite an incredible life. And that's what I found out just when we got home late in the evening. And then I obviously thought, well, hang on a minute, if that's Isabella Stubbs, what about the rest of the 3,200 bodies buried in the graveyard? And that's what I've been doing as a full-time job ever since. And then obviously, because we're in Craven, people in Settle moved to other local places, and people moved into Settle from places like Rathmell and Horswick and so you get connections all over the place. And there's so many interconnections, so obviously I started to research people in Rathmell. And then I did a talk at the Rotary Club last summer as well, and Brian was there, and Brian said, are you going to come and do Rathmell then? And anyway, as it turned out, that's how it's evolved, and so I've spent a considerable amount of time in Rathmell Graveyard over the past few weeks. I've spent a ridiculous amount of time because it's such an interesting bunch, as I hope you will find out as we go through. In the middle of all of this, the Yorkshire Dales Millennium Trust heard about what we were doing and said, oh, would you like us to publish a book about some of these stories you found? Because there's some incredible stories. And I said, oh yes, that sounds like a good idea. Not having a clue what was involved in writing a book. And I must say to you, if you're ever tempted to write a book, think twice, because the writing of it is the simplest book, isn't it, Margaret? But all the proofreading and the layout and everything, that's not what I went in it for. But anyway, we have a book, which is here. And Rosemary and the group last time liked it so much, when we put this meeting in quite a while ago, wasn't it, when we put it in, Rosemary said, I do hope you'll have some books left. Now, the books have almost gone, but we kept a box back. So if any of you want a book tonight, you're welcome to buy them. They're £5. Every single penny goes to the charities that have supported it. And the charities obviously include the church and the U3A, it's a U3A project. The Folly have been very supportive and have been running exhibitions of it and ran the book launch and things like that, as well as the Yorkshire Dales Millennium Trust. So all the proceeds go back to those charities, together with any contributions from talks and things, and the graveyard tours. Now, the graveyard tours, someone said, well, why don't we share what's happening in the graveyard in graveyard tours? And so someone said, yes, that seems a good idea. Come on, Sarah, you can do that. And hence the graveyard tours. And here they are, dressed like Gentleman Jack. We ran 7 graveyard tours last summer. An average of 27 people attended, including Julie one night, even though she didn't know what she was letting herself in for. And that appealed to quite a different sort of audience who don't necessarily come to talks, and a lot of fun was had by all. And the good news is it's going to be happening this summer as well with the updated research, so it's all good fun. So you can see it's evolved from nothing to quite a large project. And it's certainly keeping me out of mischief on a full-time basis. Kenny's probably very glad to know. Anyway, one thing that's come out of it is that it's provided a different sort of history. In Settle Church Graveyard, there is a huge family tomb for the Birkbeck family, who you may have heard of. They were the landowners, they were the JPs, they ran the banks and everything. They were hugely influential in Settle. And some people have said, well, that's the most important grave in the graveyard. Well, absolutely not, as far as I'm concerned. There are so many other stories based in that graveyard and in yours, and you can't just look at a gravestone and say they're the most important because they were the richest. The beauty of this project is that it's thrown up so many other things as well, and I hope to share some of that with you tonight. Now, whenever I do a talk, I like to tailor it to the particular occasion, which obviously I have tonight, hence spending so long in the graveyard. This church was consecrated in 1843, just after Holy Ascension, and if you were around before that, or you got married before that, or baptised, or died before that, then that was over in Giggleswick. So there's an awful lot of links between the churches. Everybody that we're talking about in the talk this evening has something to do with Rathmell. They either lived here at some point in their life, they were born here, they died here, or they got up to mischief here. One of those. So every one of them has something to do with Rathmell. I will just say now, I'm not discussing anyone who was after the beginning of the 20th century. So don't sit there thinking, oh, I hope she's not going to talk about my dad. I won't be doing that because that wouldn't be fair. But I will just say that there are quite a lot of people in the 19th century who perhaps got up to a bit of mischief and thought they got away with it. But no, here we are 200 years later and they've been caught out. So anyway, we shall see. Now, when we come on to this presentation, in the last talk we did, some of the images were not clear. And we've tried to make it as clear as we can tonight, and thanks to Tony Maguire for helping with the data projector. But I will just say that some of the images that are going to come up are from original sources, the censuses and newspaper articles, and even those originals are not particularly clear. So you may not be able to read some of those on here, but don't worry, I shall read out the important bits. It's just the nature of the beast, can't do anything about it. One other thing to say is these cards you've got in front of you with people's names on them, these are not photos of those actual people in most cases. There's one that is the real person. They are just representations of that person's class and occupation, just to give you an idea of what that person may be like. And every one of these people is going to crop up at some point during the talk this evening, unless I talk too much and I don't get to the end, and I'm already doing very well. Anyway, so listen out for your person as we go through. The other thing I'd like to say before I really kick off is that I'm an off-come done. I've only been in the area since 2012, although I've been on a lot of holidays here before that. The amount of knowledge about Rathmell in this room is phenomenal. And so if I put my foot in it and got something wrong, please forgive me. All I'm doing is saying what the information says. But you may know something else to supplement that, and if you do, I very much welcome some corrections to make the records more accurate. Anyway, just before we go any further, I'll blow my trumpet a little bit so you know what you're letting yourself in for. These are a couple of bits of feedback which have been given to the project over the last year. And first of all, can you all see the screen clearly enough, yeah? Okay, I'll just read this out. History is wonderfully complex. As a result, it is difficult to bring to life and make relevant. But my word, your work is a tour de force, a quite wonderful book and performance, full of interesting anecdotes and nuggets of information that create a very real sense of the rich social fabric of settled society, quite literally from the ground up. That was clever, wasn't it? Yeah, he is very clever. Another one I quite like here, the light way you present serious study is so impressive and a real lesson to me. You're teaching us such a lot and often telling us things that are painful as well, but it feels like following an exciting, moving mystery story. And I hope you get that sense this evening. I'm quite a nerd about this, and I've got an absolute passion for sharing this information with as many people as possible, hence tonight. So brace yourself, here we go. First of all, I'm just going to introduce you to someone who was born here. And I love this chap, I'm glad to be able to talk about him in one of the talks. This is Obadiah Baines. Has anyone got Obadiah Baines on their piece of card, on their piece of paper? Perhaps this isn't going to start too well. Or is it?
Oh yeah, sorry.
You may have got his wife with him. Have you got his wife?
Yes, that's what confused me.
Yeah, there you go. See, you have to watch out for these treats, you see. Now, Obadiah Baines was born in 1804. His father was Anthony Baines and his mother was Elizabeth Shepherd. They were a Rathmell family, but actually in the early 1800s they moved away from Rathmell to Sladeburn and also to Stainton. But Obadiah and his mum, Alice, moved to Settle. And in 1841, Obadiah, he was 37, married Mary, who was his wife, who was just 24. She was a little bit younger than he was. She was a farmer's daughter from Bentham. And they took over this building here, which you'll probably recognise in Settle, in the market square. Yeah? Now, in those days, that was where Obadiah worked. And Obadiah ran a beer house. Now, beer was encouraged by the government. They didn't have to pay expensive licences like they did for spirits to encourage people not to drink spirits because they found so many people were just getting completely drunk with spirits and gin and things. So they encouraged people to run businesses selling beer because you didn't get quite as drunk. You still can if you try hard enough, but anyway, that was the theory. And the building he was in, he rented from Elizabeth Banks, who was actually the widow of the previous chap who worked there, who was another wonderfully named man called Columbus Banks. What a brilliant name. He was a tallow chandler, candle maker, and he was there for quite a few decades as well. Anyway, that's where they were. And Obadiah and Mary had a son who died in infancy called Robert, unfortunately. They also had a daughter, Jane. Now, while they were there, a couple of crimes happened at their beer house. And these just make me smile. Not because they're crimes, but just because of the way they're written. First of all, false alarm. On Thursday evening, February the 22nd, Mr. and Mrs. O. Baines were dreadfully alarmed about 11:30 by a supposed attempt to break into their house. They called up both Mr. Cockshott, who's a policeman, and Mr. Wilkins' son, saying people were breaking into the house and had taken the window out. William of Alstwick, no notoriety, was, however, to be disturbed by attempts. He quietly continued his rest, so it's obviously someone staying there just slept. On an investigation being made, it turned out that Obadiah's dog, being locked out, had made a forcible entry through the window. How brilliant is that? Now, this is journalism in 1854. And isn't it wonderful it made the papers? This wasn't just this was the Lancaster Gazette. So it made the Lancaster Gazette. And then a couple of years later there was another crime. Beer house case. Mr. Obadiah Baines, beer seller Settle, appeared to answer a charge of keeping his house open during the hours of divine service on Sunday the 9th. Well, this is unforgivable. Having your beer house open on a Sunday, isn't that right, Julie? For the reception of persons, not travellers, and another charge of refusing to admit the constable at the same time. The former charge was taken first. Mr. Cockshott, who actually had a reputation for being really quite officious, so he was taken to court a few times for stepping beyond the call of duty. You know, he was really sticking to the law with knobs on. Mr. Cockshott, the superintendent constable, stated on oath that on the evening of the above-named Sunday he went to the defendant's house and found the door fast, that he knocked and kicked at the door for the space of 8 minutes before gaining admittance, and then found 4 persons in the house. So it took him 8 minutes to get into the house. I wonder why that was. Mr. Robinson, he's the solicitor, accordingly called 3 of the 4 persons above alluded to, who were the visitors, all of whom positively stated that the defendant's wife went to open the door immediately they heard the knocking, and that the defendant kept a very orderly house, no drink having been drawn after the bell ring for the church. Like the previous charge, the case was dismissed. So they've got very loyal customers, haven't they? We like Obadiah and his wife and his loyal customers. Now, Obadiah died in 1870, age 66. Mary carried on the beer house, and this was in the paper shortly afterwards, which is breach of beer house licence. Mary Baines of the Craven Heifer Beer House. So she called it the Craven, it may have been called the Craven Heifer Beer House before, but that was the Craven Heifer Beer House, was summoned on the information of the police with having permitted drunkenness in her house on the 6th. The case was proved by the policeman, and she was fined 2 shillings and 6pence and 8 shillings and 6pence cost, and at the same time the defendant was cautioned by the bench to be more careful for the future, otherwise her licence would not be renewed. But it's quite interesting that was what it was called. She actually did die a couple of years later. And like the last talk some of you were at, their daughter Jane married someone called Thomas Taylor, who responded to an advert like this from Liverpool, advertising a milk house. And many, many people from Settle and the Yorkshire Dales made a living by moving to Liverpool with cattle, went down on the railways, and made a living milking their cows, providing milk for Liverpool, which was the booming city at the time, with a massively expanding population who all needed milk. And so they'd have the cows down in the streets, in the backyards. There's even reports of Everton Football Club equivalent being used as where the cattle were feeding in order to make the milk. So that was quite common. Anyway, that was just a little introduction to one of the wonderful people who come from Rathmell. But coming back to Rathmell itself, just like to say you can't necessarily judge a life by its stone. Now, in Rathmell, I have to say, you are all good, hard-working, honest people. And in the 19th century, if you were born in Rathmell, lived in Rathmell, died in Rathmell, the chances are that you were a good, honest, hard-working person that didn't get up to any mischief. If you were going to get into mischief, the politics of a local small community would sort you out. So if there was anything going on, you'd probably gone somewhere else. And I must have researched, well, I've done weeks of research on some of the stones in your graveyard, and there are many, many of them where I could say, yes, this person was a farmer, he married this girl who was a farmer's daughter, they had however many children, the sons became farmers, the daughters married farmers, and then they carried on, and the same thing happened again. Now that might be interesting for you if you live in one of the places where they were, but after 3 hours of that you might get a bit bored. So I'm not going to do really many of those. So I will be looking at a few that may have moved elsewhere, just to have a slightly different life. This gravestone is one of the most impressive in the graveyard. You probably recognise it at the gate there just as you come in. Huge gravestone, you think, oh, that must be something really big and important. Now, some of you may know something about this family, I don't know. But I spent ages trying to trace them and think, well, how have they managed to afford a massive gravestone? They must have been really important. They must have been in Rathmell for decades. In fact, the chap, I mean, this gravestone is Charles Abbottson. He died when he was only 31 or 32. He was only in Rathmell for a couple of years before he died, and his wife then immediately moved away with their few children and married a merchant who was quite rich, and so probably they paid for his gravestone. But in terms of lots of interesting information about Rathmell, I'm afraid I can't tell you anything about that, but there are other gravestones which have far more to offer us, as we shall see. There's a couple of houses I've looked at which have turned up some really quite interesting bits. So, for example, we'll look at this 1841 census. Now, this is a house in Rathmell, and this is one of the poorest quality images. We've got Henry Clark. Who's Henry Clark? Is one of you Henry Clark?
Yes,
Henry Clark? Yes, Henry Clark. You can see at the top he's listed as being 80. We also have Betsy Clark. Do we have Betsy Clark? Yes. Betsy Clark, 35. Catherine, who we may or may not have a card for.
yeah, it's on the same one.
It's on the same one, because they're sisters. She's 30. We've also got someone called Bridget Tatum, who is 10, and George Bowman, who is 18. Now, the 1841 census didn't tell us a huge amount, but it does tell us, for example, the relative ages. George Bowman at the bottom, who is 18, that scrawl in the third column there says MS. That means he was a male servant. If it was a female servant, guess what that's listed as? So that probably tells you that Henry Clark is quite rich, reinforced by the fact at the top his occupation up there is listed as IND, independent. The last column, where they've all got the letter Y scrawled, means they were all born in Yorkshire. I'll keep going. Okay, keep going. So that doesn't tell you that much. In the 1841 census, it doesn't tell you what relation these people are to each other, or their marital status or anything. The ages were often rounded down. So, for example, Betsy, who's listed as 35, was actually 40. Catherine was 32. Children under the age of 10 were often kept about right, and in fact that is right. And George Bowman was actually 22. Henry, I don't know about. He's so old, I can't find his birth anywhere. But anyway, so that's just the 1841 census. Now, what house was this? This is the house that they lived in. I don't know, perhaps some of you live here now. Do you recognise it? Millgate House. Yeah, that is Millgate House. Now, Henry had actually married a girl called Bridget Armistead. The Armistead family are actually, there's some stories about them in the book. Both of them born in Rathmell. The Armisteds were a very wealthy family from Low Bentham. They lived in Robert Hall in Low Bentham, if you know that. And we know that Henry had been here, he was in the tax registration things since about 1820. So he'd been there quite a long time, probably from when they first got married. Bridget had died by now, and so Henry is living here with some of these people. If we just go through this, they had 6 daughters, and this in itself tells us quite a lot. These are the daughters down here. These are the ones we know about. There may have been some born and died before that. So they had Grace, Bridget, Isabella, Betsy, Mary, Catherine. These are the men that they married. Now, we've already mentioned Betsy. Grace married John Talbot, another tallow chandler. They moved to Blackburn and had 5 children. Bridget married Francis Clark. Bridget was already called Clark. Bridget Clark married Francis Clark. I can't find relation. I can't see them being related. He was a farmer. They lived in Clitheroe, had 2 children. Isabella married William Tatum. You might recognise that name from the census. He was a grocer, and they moved to Blackburn, had 3 children. Betsy was going to marry Barnabas Battersby. Do we have Barnabas Battersby in our midst?
Yeah.
What a fantastic name is that. He was a farmer, and they would stay in Rathmell, didn't have any children. Mary married Thomas Holden. We should have Mary and Thomas Holden. Yep. He was a farmer, Rathmell, 7 children. And Catherine married Samuel Littlewood, an iron moulder, who came from Sheffield, and they moved to Blackburn and didn't have any children. Now, this is obviously quite a wealthy family, but the oldest one, Grace, and also Mary, Both of those two were 6 months pregnant when they got married. Now this was not unusual because contraceptives were nowhere in sight, and also there is a theory that men wanted to have lots of children to keep their family name going and run the farm, and so they wanted a wife who was fertile. And so it was distinctly quite common for a wife to be pregnant when she married. In the research that I've done, the people in Settle, it's between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 were pregnant at the time of marriage or had already had an illegitimate child. The other thing that's interesting about these 6 daughters is that 4 of them were 15 years or more younger than their husbands. Now that isn't quite as normal, but if a man's wife died, which was quite common in childbirth, it was quite common for him to marry a much younger model for wife number 2, so that she could then have children and produce more children. And there are examples where the man's married a much younger one and the mother-in-law is younger than he is, for example. It isn't unusual. It was socially acceptable to do that. It was not socially acceptable for a woman to marry a younger man. No toy boys in the 19th century. It was not acceptable. And in cases where that did happen, women have lied on their marriage certificate and ever afterwards so that it isn't apparent, even on official forms. So, even though these wives were a lot younger than the husbands, that meant the husband may have died first. So a lot of this family, the sisters, lived together after their husbands had died. Obviously no welfare state, they looked after each other. So let's just see where we're up to. Back to this is what we had before. So we've got Henry, his daughter Betsy, his daughter Catherine. Bridget Tatum is a granddaughter, and George Bowman is a servant. Now, if we go on to the 1851 census, I don't expect you to read this, but you can see there's a lot more information. And it's got the name of the house, which it didn't have before. It's got a much clearer list of occupation. It's got far more accurate ages, and it's got the place that these people were born. If we just have a look, I've just expanded that middle section, we can see that Henry Clark is no more. Henry has deceased. He deceased in 1843 before the graveyard here was opened, so he's not buried here. Betsy has now married Barnabas Battersby. Catherine has disappeared. But we also have here Bridget Tatum, who is the niece of Betsy, who was there before, and we also have a servant. Now Catherine has disappeared and Betsy has got married. They both got married at Giggleswick Church. The reason they've got married at Giggleswick in 1846 is because there wasn't a licence to marry at Rathmell then, because of the church, the way the church was being set up. The marriage licence didn't come till quite a bit later. I think it was 1849. Now, this is Betsy and Barnaby. The top one is Catherine and Samuel. Those of you with eagle eyes will see that they both had the same witnesses. William Armistead, who was an uncle, and Isabella Tatum, who was their sister. And the other thing you may notice is the dates. They were both married on June 2nd, so it was a double wedding. And you haven't got the ages on there, but both their husbands were a lot older and they'd been married before. Catherine and her husband Samuel moved to Blackburn. So, if we just move on through the censuses, in the next census, 1861, you can see we've got Betsy there, who's described as a widow. Poor old Barnabas has died. We've still got Bridget Tatum, the niece. We've got a servant called Thomas something or other. That's not his name, it's just I can't read it. And then we've also got Samuel Littlewood and Catherine. She's come back to live with them. So they're there in 1861. In 1871, we've got Betsy together with Catherine. You can see they're both widowed. And then in 1881, if we look at Millgate House, we can see there are no Betsy Battersby or Catherine Littlewood. At Millgate House, we've got William Parsons. Have we got William Parsons in our midst? William Parsons. Now remember him, we're going to come back to him. But if you look at the top, you can see we've got Betsy Battersby, second line down, living with Mary Holden. And you may be able to read, she's described as a sister. This is one of the other sisters. And on the census,